Welcome to the History Unplugged podcast, the unscripted show that celebrates unsung heroes, myth-busts historical lies, and rediscovers the forgotten stories that changed our world. I'm your host, Scott Rank. Hi everyone, welcome back to our series on key battles in the Revolutionary War. In the first two episodes, we talked about the world of the 18th century and the series of political acts that Britain launched that agitated colonists and got to the point where they took up arms. Essentially, what we looked at was that England was bankrupt from the French and Indian Wars and thought they could generate some money from their colonists. You know, James, don't you think that's reasonable? Hey, we invested all this money in building a colony. We can get a little back. Don't you think that makes sense?
It makes sense to me. It certainly made a lot of sense to the British government. But the colonists didn't see it that way.
Yeah, it either did not make sense or they acted as though it did not make sense and took up arms. And now we're going to see what happens when they do, when they're antagonized after a few years with the Boston Massacre, the Boston Tea Party, what they think are intolerable acts by the British against them, and things are going to erupt into arms. So let's get down to it. What is the first battle we're going to look at here in our key battles?
Well, this is key battle number one, and honestly, these barely count as battles, especially Lexington. And technically, it's two separate engagements, Lexington and Concord, but we're going to treat them together as one battle because they happened within the space of a few hours of each other, and they were in two towns that weren't very far apart. So yeah, we'll say the battles of Lexington and Concord, key battle number one.
All right, so let's just go right into it. I think we were with British General Gage in the previous episode.
Yeah, a little background. We saw in the last episode that the British government, because of all the trouble in Boston, the natives were getting restless, so to speak, the colonists, that is. And there had been a lot of trouble. We had seen the Boston Tea Party, and the British government didn't take very kindly to that. And they passed a series of measures that they called the Coercive Acts to try to get the people of Massachusetts into line. The colonists did not like them, of course. They called them the Intolerable Acts. And one other thing that the British government did was they replaced the civilian governor, a man named Thomas Hutchinson, with a military governor and essentially put at least Boston, if not the whole colony. They didn't have a lot of control over the whole colony of Massachusetts, but the British did have pretty firm control over Boston. They had a couple thousand troops there, and they put it essentially under martial law. They didn't use that term, but that's what we would say today. And so the man in charge, he's the governor of Massachusetts, military governor, and he is also the commander-in-chief of all British forces in the colonies, and that is General Thomas Gage. We gave a little bit of background on him. He had been in the French and Indian War. He'd been in the British Army for a long time. He had fought alongside Washington at the Battle of the Monongahela. Make sure I say that right. It's kind of hard to say. But anyway, now Gage's mission is to keep the people quiet and to try to get any tax money that he could and get it sent in, but especially keep the people quiet. Now, Gage realized that the colonists were starting to walk around with rifles, and they were starting to drill. Militia companies were popping up everywhere. And he realized that things could get ugly really quickly. So he ordered that the Provincial Store, in other words, the store belonging to the province of gunpowder in Somerville, he ordered that it would be seized. Somerville's about 6 miles from Boston. Much of it, though, had already been moved elsewhere. The colonists lit signal fires, and more militia units were called up while loyalists fled to Boston for safety. So Boston becomes the hub of loyalist activity. More and more Tories or loyalists moved to Boston, whereas the surrounding towns were becoming more and more patriot or rebel, if you will. Depends on who you ask, who's a patriot and who's a rebel. But anyway, so the rebels, or the patriots, we'll call them that. And again, I'm just using patriot as a technical term for someone who is opposed to the British government and what they're doing. Now, they're not necessarily in favor of independence at this point. Very few colonists would say at this point in 1774 that they want to be independent from Britain. They just want to have their rights respected. The independence thing is going to be a little bit later.
Yeah, well, I just want to say that's very interesting. It's like the Civil War, where the initial impetus for fighting, it changes into something else as the fighting goes on. The initial impetus for many in the Civil War was not at all emancipation. That comes later as the fighting goes on. Same thing here. Independence, probably there for some, but never the original goal. So that's interesting to point out.
Yeah, they're just trying to get their rights as they saw it reinstated, and get rid of these things like the Intolerable Acts. Now, inside Boston, there was a committee formed called the Committee of Observation, and it was under the leadership of Paul Revere. And as you can guess from the name, Committee of Observation, their job was to monitor British troop movements and to stay connected and in communication with the militia units on the outskirts of the city in places like Lexington and Concord and Cambridge and other places in the area. So Paul Revere now steps onto the scene. And Scott, I think you wanted to say something about Paul Revere specifically.
Yeah, we'll come back to him later on his midnight ride. I won't say any more, not to spoil anything. I learned some interesting facts about him that made his part in the story make a lot more sense. That he was a very well-known figure in New England life. He's a member of several clubs. He's a card player, a fisherman, a businessman. Any sort of local event that's happening, he's almost always at the center of it. There's hundreds, if not thousands, at his funeral when he dies. And we'll come back to that later, but I just want to mention that he's a very well-connected person in the colonies.
Right, yeah. Some people forget about that. We think of him as the man that did the midnight ride, and some people know he was a silversmith, a very talented silversmith. He was also a very good artist. We referred in passing to his drawing of the so-called Boston Massacre, which was a great piece of propaganda. It really helped fire people up, fire the people of Massachusetts up against the British government. It was not accurate, of course, but hey, that wasn't the point.
Yeah.
All right, so yeah, more on Paul Revere later, but for now he's kind of almost like a coordinator of intelligence, wouldn't you say, Scott? Just kind of like head of Patriot intelligence in Boston.
It's very informal, but it'll become something much better later on, and it's loose, which gives the Patriots problems at this time. But yeah, something like that.
Okay, so meanwhile, we've been talking a lot about Boston and Massachusetts, but especially Boston. But trouble is starting to spread to other areas. In Rhode Island and New Hampshire, two colonies pretty close by, militia units are seizing weapons and ammo. So we're starting to see more and more ammunition that I guess technically belonged to the British, but the Patriots are now commandeering it, getting hold of it, just in case there's going to be a fight. In February of 1775, Gage tried to seize more weapons and ammo at Salem, Massachusetts, the home of the famous witch trials. Actually, yeah, technically it's not. But anyway, work with me, people. Come on.
Close enough. Come on.
Salem. The witch trials were actually in Salem Village, which later became the town of Danvers. This is Salem town. Anyway, the point is that Gage is trying to go and basically scoop up all the weapons that he can and all the ammo and all the powder. But in this case, he is unsuccessful. He's not able to take the stuff from Salem. Militia units turn him back. So Gage is beginning to realize, oh my gosh, what have I gotten myself into? This is not good. It seems like the whole world's going crazy around me. I'm stuck in Boston. He built defenses around Boston Neck, and he asked the king for 20,000 additional troops. The king said, right. Do you have any idea how much that costs, General Gage? No. Instead, he sends 700 Royal Marines. Marines are great, but only 700. And I want to take a minute, Scott, and give our listeners one of my famous, or not really famous, but one of my mental maps.
Oh, right.
At the time. Yeah. So I want people to understand just how precarious the British situation in Boston is becoming, because it's not that way today. But at the time, Boston was almost an island. Boston was on a kind of quasi-circular peninsula, and it was connected to the mainland only by a little skinny strip of land, which is called Boston Neck. And the way I like to visualize it is everybody knows what a ping pong paddle looks like, right?
I
Scott,
hope so.
Play ping pong, Scott?
I've lost many, many times in college, I'm proud to say. I know ping pong well.
Yeah, me too. I've slammed my paddle down on the table more than once and had the thing break off in my hand. But so if you visualize a ping pong paddle sticking up from a piece of land, the handle is Boston Neck, and then the part that's the part you actually hit the ball with, the paddle itself, that is Boston, and Boston is surrounded by water on almost all sides except for Boston Neck. Then beyond that is more land, and that land is where the American troops are going to end up later. We'll talk about that later. But what's going to happen over time is the populations of the surrounding towns, again, Salem, Lexington, Concord, Cambridge, where Harvard and MIT are today, they're becoming extremely, gradually more radicalized and anti-British. And what's going to happen is Gage is not going to be able to get out of there. But anyway, so here's Gage. He's got a couple thousand guys and now 27,000 Royal Marines. And he's just trying to keep the situation from completely blowing up in his face.
Here's something I'm curious about. Now, you mentioned these troop numbers. He doesn't get his request fulfilled, although many, many British troops come later when this Cold War turns hot. But something I don't want to take for granted is how long does it take troops to come from England? And are they coming from England? And the reason I'm curious is we usually just gloss over this, but when we looked at the Civil War, one of the biggest challenges was troop movement, where when you don't have railroad tracks or good roads, it really takes a long time to move troops. This is moving troops against an enemy on the same landmass. But for the Revolutionary War, we're talking about sending thousands of troops on sail ship, not even steamship, where it takes weeks and there could be inclement weather to slow things down. So how long does it take? Are they coming from England? Are they coming from the Caribbean, elsewhere?
To get technical, I'm thinking about this because in American History Fanatics, we have a man who lives in Canada, but he's from Scotland originally. And every time somebody uses the word England, he he corrects them. He jumps on their case. So he says there is no nation of England today. Okay, so technically since 1707, England, Scotland, Wales, and Ireland. After 1707, those four nations were the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland. So
that's right. I knew it was in the 1700s. I was being precise, but it turns out I was just being precisely wrong. So
I'm thinking about my buddy Stephen. If you're listening, I hope you appreciate that. And any of our other British listeners, we're not trying to insult the nation by just calling it England. But it's interesting that to answer your question with that correction thrown in, most of the troops are coming from Great Britain at this time, or the United Kingdom, to be completely correct. It's interesting, Scott, that the majority of them, or at least a big minority, are actually Irish and Scottish. So they're not really English. And that just presents an interesting dynamic. But most of them are loyal to the crown. The Irish aren't really happy about being under the domination of Great Britain at this time, as they never were. But the thing about being in the army, and we're going to do a whole sidetrack episode on what it was like to be a British soldier as well as a continental soldier. We'll do that next time. But for now, suffice it to say that being in the British Army was a way to get a steady job. It was a way to get 3 meals a day. And discipline was brutal. But as long as you kept your nose clean and didn't get in trouble and didn't try to run away, it wasn't a bad life. Well, as long as you didn't get shot either, that's always a plus. Or get disease. We're going to see that a lot of soldiers are going to die of disease.
Oh, yeah. But Mr. Malaria is going to rear his ugly head. Yeah,
worse than the Civil War even, in terms of the percentage that died of disease. But anyway, so yes, most of them are coming from the United Kingdom. You have a few British regular troops stationed in Canada, but they're going to stay in Canada for the most part. They're not going to be moved too much because there's always the threat of an American invasion of Canada. There really just aren't that many people in Canada at this point, and so the Americans they're always going to have that in their mind to go up and seize Canada and maybe add it to the United States. And we're going to see later they're going to give it the old college try.
A little bit of Northern Manifest Destiny.
Yeah, exactly. They're going to